We got a Patreon, Ian.
We do. Patreon.com/CU podcast. You go, you pay a little, you get what writings? I'll get one up soon. You get bonus bits,
weekly bonus podcast. We talked about Stranger Things and the slasher Winnie the Pooh movie that was is coming out.
Movies in general. You get the full video podcast, and you get to be part of voting on these poll topics.
You do, and everyone's super happy with all the choices ever that they vote on.
Oh yeah, they're always so happy.
In second place, defending retro games that most people dislike, 34%. And in first place, 66%. That's supermajority. That's the veto supermajority to overwrite the veto. If video game years was remade, what would we done differently now? This is the 10th year anniversary of the video game years.
Sure.
And it's one of the most common things that brought up to at least me, if not Ian, when we go to conventions. They say, I love video game years. You know, it'd be great to see the 90s. 90s is not happening. I'll just say that before we get to the topic. But it's interesting that we talked about before the progression of like video game documentaries and even the past 3-4 years, how many more they've had versus 10 years ago when there really wasn't much of anything. There was like less than a handful at the time. And looking back, when we go back and watch, I don't know how often you watch. I don't know if you watch when I re-premiered them on my channel last year.
I can't watch myself.
You can't watch
I cannot do it.
But in general, though, in terms of the tone and style of video game years, it was VH1. I love the 80s.
Yes, of course. That was it. No, there was no hiding it. That was the influence.
And that was sort of like the in vogue sort of documentary style for sort of like not saying the video game stuff was silly, and there was more serious topics.
Yeah,
like the video game crash and things like that. But like that was sort of like the structure that we said this is acceptable at the time.
Yeah.
10 years later, that's not the acceptable structure for doing documentaries or edutainment. It just isn't.
Well, it's not. It's certainly not the structure for anything that's going to be 45 minutes in length.
Sure.
People will look up similarly concise information on games, but they'll look it up specifically.
Sure. And also the style has become like we want to deep dive into one topic for like 20 minutes or a half hour, or like Norm does Super Mario World, it's over an hour long.
Right.
Versus like if we did Super Mario World in the video games, video game years, 91, it would have been 5-6 minutes. We could have talked about a lot about the game and a little bit of the history, but we're not doing what someone like Norm's doing. We just
right. No, not at all.
It doesn't fit the format. It's like get in, get out, basically the sort of thing. Super Mario Bros. We talked about probably for 5-6 minutes. So Super Mario World probably would have been the same thing.
Right.
So when you look at like what we have done differently, I think we would have, at least in my mind, Ian, we would have condensed down the subjects into a lot less. We would have.
Yes. We would have done less topics. We would have done less topics with more in depth on each topic.
With deeper dive. So say like, we would have done, maybe we would have been like 8 topics a year, something like that. So at least each topic gets 5-6 minutes, 7 minutes each, something like that. Yeah. That probably would have been, and we did start out with only that amount of topics earlier on when there's less to talk about.
There was less to talk about.
But once you hit the 80s, there's just the arcade explosion. There's just too much to talk about.
Well, and there is, I would say 80% of what we covered was stuff that was worth covering. It's just, was it worth covering in that amount of time?
Yes.
And it's tough too, once you get into the nitty gritty and you get into like just this dump of potential topics. It's tough to make the cut. It's tough to decide where to make the cut. And I mean, the crazy thing is about all the amount of topics we did for some of those years, we had more. We started with more. Yeah, and basically how that worked
and we forgot a very important game. The one important game I forgot about was Pirates that we did not talk about.
Oh, I love that game
Super important game. And out of all the games, like we hit all the ones we should have, we forgot about that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. But it was like you and Rue would kind of get the topics together, and if there was a tiebreaker vote,
Ian was a tiebreaker.
I was kind of a tiebreaker.
Yeah, because Rue and me had wildly different.
If there was, I'm sorry, if you two were alternate, one was pro, one was negative, I had to
break the tie.
Yeah,
but I think looking back, what I would have done, Ian, was basically like almost like how the Museum of Play has the Hall of Fame. These games have to be like almost Hall of Fame worthy to be spoken about.
They do.
Or super important cases.
Yes.
Like the Casey Munchkin like lawsuit thing. Like that's important enough to get in because it's super important. Like either super important to the industry or it's like a Hall of Fame game. Looking back, that's what I wanted. So I hate to say it, my favorite arcade game, Rolling Thunder, would not have made my new version of it. I hate to say it, Goonies 2 in the NES ain't making it, Ian. No. But we're talking about like these games have to tell you cannot tell the history of video games basically without these subjects. That's the way I would phrase it.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost like you have to, like, without these, you lose something in the grand scheme of things.
Well, and I think so to I kind of go off of what you were saying. If we went back, it wouldn't be less topics. It would be drastically less topics because you'd have to really stick to what you said.
Yes.
And we would lose, and I don't mean it necessarily as a negative, but we would lose 2/3, half of those topics.
Unless we did something like, we could have done like more generic topics about like how like the video game crash wasn't a specific game. So if we did like, okay, we're going to talk about, Ian, all the adventure PC games.
Yeah.
From like these 3-4 years that came out that were super important. All the Sierra ones, all the ones like Ultima. Like if we just bundled some of those together.
Sure.
It's more like short stories. That's how I probably would see it being.
Cover a topic and not a specific game.
Yes.
And you can rattle off names of games in there.
And
but
reference them quickly and then move
devote
on.
15-20 minutes to PC games and move on instead of bringing up every PC game, every adventure game every year that is important.
And I don't think we would be stuck to the year format then. It would just be like general
you
topics.
you couldn't really do the year format.
It would be like this was my dream that pandemic didn't help, but also I realized I don't have the the backing to do a project. I wanted to do for the NBA did basically 50 short stories about the history of the NBA, and some were like very like stuff you heard about. It's like Jordan's Nike deal. Well, then there was also like a story about this basketball camp that was super important that all these future Hall of Famers went to. Like all these like Hall of Famers went to this camp like in the late 70s, early 80s. So it's like something you never heard about, something interesting, but you only spend like maybe like 3-4 minutes on it.
Right.
But then something like the Jordan Nike thing, that's like 15 minutes or like 12 minutes. So like you have these little like slices of life that you look at as you go through. Like for example, like going back to like Norm did like, he's done videos just like on all the Zapper games, for example.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily do something on all the Zapper games, but maybe talk about like light guns being a new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would work great.
And go through like the Sega Master System light gun, go through the Zapper, go through the Atari's light gun, and you just have this interesting slice of technology and maybe how that became, big light gun arcade games, and then talk about that. To me is how I would structure a video game years like story in the future. It was attempted. Netflix came out with this a couple years ago, Ian, the High Score documentary.
Yes,
and we spoke about it, and I did not give it the highest of grades. I thought it was too small in scope in terms of who they spoke to. It was kind of the topics didn't line up all the time. They weren't married well to each other.
I agree.
In the episodes, it almost seemed like, well, Ian, we're going to talk to 6 people this episode. Let's try to make an episode out of it. Like that's what it seemed. But they did do the one good segment, and this is one I thought about if I ever did new video game years. They talked to Jerry Lawson.
Yep, that was a great segment. That was probably the best part. It was easily the highlight of the show.
Well, they talked to his family. Jerry Lawson was basically the creator of the cartridge game. Created the cartridge game, and he worked on the Fairchild Channel F. And most people never heard of Jerry Lawson before.
Right.
I don't think he was a guy who did like a lot of interviews and he died in 2011. So that, retro gaming, sort of blew up the past 10 years more. Like if he was still around, I'm sure people would have talked to him and got him interviews. So that was great. They talked to, I think it was the daughter and the grandson.
Yes.
And talked about like just a little bit of his history at the company. They showed him playing a Fairchild, and no one talks about the Fairchild Channel F at all.
No,
we brought up in video game years in '77 just because it was so important for '76. That was the other thing I would do. So anyway, so the point is like it was more of an intimate profile of someone. I think that would be probably more of my vision if the show was remade, something like that.
Yeah.
But another thing I would have definitely done, Ian, is I think what are you smiling?
I'm waiting to hear it because when you start something off like that, it's going to be interesting. What would you have
wow,
done?
you didn't give me credit. Okay, I would have done basically 25 minutes, everything before basically up to the Odyssey. So we're talking tennis for 2. If it's even 20 minutes, the stupid tic-tac-toe game, the MIT computer stuff, Space War, everything.
We should have had precisely one episode on.
We should have one episode, everything up to 77. We probably could have done that.
Sure, yeah.
And we could have included the Fairchild. We could have done Odyssey. We could have done all the Pong clones. We did the Pong clones in 77, but we could have done that before.
We covered.
But the point is, yes, we should have done. Looking back, we should have done basically pre 77, because that's when it really took off. We could have covered.
Well, I would say what I was going to go with. So that's actually a little different than I agree that we could have done one short episode on that,
like a half hour.
But I feel like honestly, 77 to 80 we might have been able to truncate.
There was some filler.
Those early episodes are filler.
We should have done a Star Wars segment. We shouldn't have done Simon because that's not a video game. Like that's.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
we really stretched it. We could at least 77 and 78.
Once you get to 79, Galaxy and Namco stuff, you take
but
off
77
more.
and 78 should have been one
Space
episode.
Invaders. Space Invaders was 78.
I thought that was
70.
I thought that was 77.
No, it wasn't. No. It was Space Invaders came out in 78. Yes. So the point is that okay, you would have done that.
I would have done that.
I think we should have done shorter episodes for that.
Could have done that too. We were pretty intent on the 45-minute.
Yes, because it was thinking about TV format still.
Yeah.
John comes from the TV world. That's probably what was part of it. Retroware TV, it's in the name. But yeah, I definitely a pre-77 episode.
Yeah.
Odyssey, the first Odyssey, Pong clones, computer space, Space Worlds, Wars, Pong, all that stuff. Tennis for two. That's enough. A half hour even, you get to that. We can do 5 minutes on the Odyssey. We weren't around for 50 years ago, but like we could have done 5 minutes on the Odyssey.
Sure.
And how important it was. And Ralph Baer. We turned 100 in May. They did a posthumous rededication up in New Hampshire, his home state for him. He has a little bronze thing of him sitting down.
Oh, that's cool.
In the park there.
I had no idea.
And it's the 50th anniversary. This, I believe, September, or it's the fall, September of the Odyssey. So there you go. Pretty important year for video games. Pretty important year.
Yeah.
Pretty important year there. We'll see if something happens with that. Any other thoughts? Ian? Thanks for saying I had an interesting thought, Ian. You never think I'd say something interesting. That's fantastic.
Sure you do.
Sure I do.
Anyway, no, I have no other thoughts. That's about where I would end it.
Okay.